Welcome to another Fortuna Admissions videocast, and I'm joined by my colleague Karla Cohen, who is a former Associate Director at Harvard Business School. Karla, thanks a lot for being with us for this session.
My pleasure.
Now, of course, you've seen the entire admissions cycle to the MBA program at HBS, and we're going to talk today about interviewing. And being one of those lucky few. I think the school interviews about 15 or 1,600 people for the 942 places that are available. So perhaps we could just sort of start with maybe talking us through a typical HBS interview.
Sure. So the HBS interviews are going to be unique in a number of ways. First and foremost is they're concentrated not so much on behavioral style questions. Those could come up, such as the tell me about a time when you struggled with a certain challenge. But the HBS interviews are far more about walking through your resume to a large degree, and not so much where you've worked, but why you worked in those different places, and also getting a sense of your understanding of your role within these different organizations at different levels. They will push you in terms of trying to understand what was your rationale for making different moves. And that goes as deep as why did you decide to go to your undergraduate institution? And they may even ask about classes that you took, just to get a sense of how you handled, to a large degree, unexpected questions. So there's no script per se in terms of what the interviewer can talk about, but they may have a set of questions based on your application, but primarily looking at what you've done professionally. So they'll push on your goals, and they'll want to understand, why is it that you want to get an MBA right now? Do you fully understand that it's a general management program and what the skill set that's being offered and the education that's being offered will do for you? And then are you able to understand how that connects to your specific goals? And so if you don't have a very clearly defined set of interests or goals for post-MBA, it can be challenging at this stage in the interview, because you need to be sure that you're able to articulate not only why an MBA, but how that's going to serve as a catalyst for your own success post-MBA. So that's a core part of the conversation, and it is going to feel very conversational. So they don't necessarily sit down with a list of set questions that they're going to ask everyone. The interview is going to be unique to your specific experiences, as well as potentially what you wrote about in your essay. But to a very large degree, they're trying to figure out, do you seem like the person who we thought we met on paper? So they're going to try and understand, are you who we think you are? And it's ultimately a search for authenticity.
Right. Now, famously, of course, while other schools might involve alumni, or they have sort of team-based discussion formats, this is either a one-to-one or sometimes a two-to-one, but it's always sort of 30 minutes, and it's always with someone from the admissions office.
That's right.
That provides a level of sort of consistency.
Exactly. And so the purpose there is that these are seasoned interviewers, and in many cases they're graduates of the school themselves. So they've done an MBA, and so they have had successful careers and are usually going to have experience in your sector. So there can be some variability there, depending on, and those are things that they could potentially switch up. But to a large degree, they want to have someone who has experience either in your own background where you're coming from, or in the place that you're looking to go to, because a lot of what they'll do is look at what sector have you come from, and they'll divide applications and evaluate you against others who are coming from that field, let's say consulting or finance. And so you'll be compared to those individuals, but then they also look at where you're headed. So they're going to want to find someone who has a sense of the market, if at all possible, in both, in what you're doing before and where you want to go, to just get a sense of, do you have the right blend of both ambition as well as realism in terms of what you want to do. So, there are certain transitions that even an MBA from HBS would be difficult to facilitate. So that's kind of what they're digging at there, is that, do you understand, what's ahead for you, and is it ambitious enough to be interesting, and have you actually really thought it out tactically? So beyond just, these are my goals and inspirations in terms of why I want to be here, beyond just the power of the HBS brand, but do you have a plan of action? So if you say you want to be an entrepreneur and you want to go in a certain sector, you better be able to articulate with a level of specificity what that is, and then talk about it as if you understand the market. You don't have to have a full education, and won't be expected to have the depth of an education that an MBA would provide, but they'll be testing for this kind of sense of, do you have a broader sense of the market? Like, so what are the core challenges that this industry is facing as you understand them? And it's not necessarily a right or wrong, but they just want to get a sense of how deeply have you thought about these things, and do you think about these things in a way that lends them to believe that you would do well in a classroom where the case method dominates. So you're going to have to stick up for your points of view. You can't just, offer different ideas without any support for those ideas or any thoughts or points of view. So they're going to want to see some sort of evidence as to why do you feel the way that you feel.
Right, so they've already seen your resume, possibly even essays and recommendations, and discussed your profile in an admissions committee session. How well do they know you? And are they looking to validate what they saw on paper, or sometimes meet candidates that they're just speculating and saying, different, very interesting, we should meet them?
It's a great question. So the way that it has worked in the past is that there's usually the lead interviewer who has seen your entire application and probably thought about it rather deeply. They've, brought you in because they think you have very strong potential in terms of being able to do well in the program. There could be a second person in the room, and oftentimes there is, who's only seen your resume. So they may ask clarifying questions. They might ask, for more depth and detail, not having the full context of the application you provided. And they're usually there as a set of, a second set of eyes, and to make sure that there aren't any sort of biases that have come out from reading your entire application that could be influencing the lead interviewer. So again, those, the thoughts of the interviewers that usually there's two. It's not always the case. Sometimes when you're off campus, there's only one person who's traveling, and so you'll be interviewed by one person who's usually quite senior and also someone who has established some credibility in terms of their ability to interview and select candidates who are well suited for the program. So they take this process very, very seriously, and a lot of it will come down to how you perform in the actual interview. So it's really important to think deeply about each stage of your career, and also very deeply about why you're doing the things that you want to do with a general management degree. So if you're interested in development, for example, you better have a strong argument as to why you're not just applying to the Kennedy School, for example. So there's a number of things that they'll be testing in terms of, is this actually what you want? The common mistake is that oftentimes people think of HBS as kind of a leadership school, but it's so much more than that. And so they want to make sure that you appreciate that and really understand what you're getting yourself into, and will be someone who can contribute to the class in a way that is meaningful, and that you have a point of view that is well articulated. And if you can't do that at the interview stage, then you're going to be in big trouble for the case method.
Right. Now, of course, you put together an application that hopefully has been sort of a process of self-reflection to get to this point. But in terms of your experience and candidates that you've interviewed, advice, you talk about sort of knowing your story and decisions that you've made, having that sense of a market, and being able to speak meaningfully about perhaps 4 ways the industry might change, but also that authenticity. What other advice would you offer? It sounds perhaps cliche, but what can be frustrating as an interviewer is people that seem overly rehearsed. If your answer sounds rehearsed and polished or formulaic, inauthentic in a way that it's not like you're afraid of actually saying how you feel or speaking on your feet. If it sounds like I could almost hear a number of times where it sounded like the person was hitting play on what they'd recorded in their head or memorized, and that was always a turnoff. So you really want it to feel very conversational and be yourself. This is a selection and matching process to a large degree, and the more you can actually step into, why did you make those decisions? What were you actually thinking? There's no right or wrong answer. They just really want to understand your thought process. And so the closer you can get to the truth really does resonate in a way. And so when you're not acting, when you're not playing a certain role that you think they want to see, it usually goes better. And so the best interviews were the ones that just felt a little bit more relaxed, where the person had sort of a quiet confidence. Arrogance is something to be very careful of, because it was one of those things that you always had to be very, very careful to sniff that out as well, because that does not combine well with an HBS MBA. So we really wanted to look for people that had humility and let their accomplishments speak for themselves to a large degree, but also were very honest and reflective. You don't need to make it sound like you were the only person involved in a deal. You don't need to make it sound like it was, obviously, that it was your own
efforts that made everything possible all the time, unless that's actually how it happened. So you need to be very, very careful, but I think that the best ones overall really are when people dig deep and just think about, and take the time too. Sometimes people are afraid for just a moment of pause. So sometimes if you get stumped, what I found really refreshing is that, sometimes it would be a hard question, and then someone would sit back and just relax and just like take a deep breath and say, that's a really good question, that's really interesting, let me think about that, and then took a moment to actually come up with something interesting to say versus just coming out with whatever came out of the top of their head. So that would be my advice, is just don't try to be somebody that you're not. And don't try to inflate or exaggerate, because you're going to be working with people that are talking to people that have really intense, broad experience in the area that you're in. And if you're trying to overly inflate your importance or your skill set, that is going to usually come through in a way and not play well. So really think about, sit down and try and ask yourself the questions about why you made different decisions at every stage of your career. What are you really hoping to do? And try and carve out as much evidence that you can feel, passionate about when you talk about it. You want the enthusiasm to be there, but you also want the honesty and the realism to be the undertone that sort of feeds through the entire conversation.
Right. Now, I'm mindful that it's a 30-minute session, which sometimes must go by so quickly, right?
Yeah.
But also then the pressure that have I said everything that I need to? If you felt that candidates had maybe sort of stumbled off track and lost their thread, just sort of breathe, to take a moment, and you can catch up from those situations, right?
Absolutely, and I think that's the other important thing to think about, is that you're dealing with human beings here, and they don't want it to be uncomfortable for you. They're not trying to stump you. They're just trying to understand who you are as an individual. They're not trying to do any trick questions. And one of the reasons why I really liked the HBS interview process was that it wasn't these sort of abstract, obscure questions about, why did you do X, Y, or Z? It was very much related to, tell me about this. Tell me about, when you moved from here to here, or when you decided to get this major, or tell me about, this move up within your firm. Why did you stay with the same firm the whole time, or why did you move to a bunch of different places? And so being able to kind of map out a story that doesn't need to be fabricated, but just makes sense. It should actually make sense. And usually, again, that just comes from telling them exactly what happened. Tell them why you were thinking what you were thinking, or I didn't really know, I wanted to try something different. So the best interviews were always the ones where it just felt like a very natural conversation, where you felt like you were actually getting the real person in front of you, and having a detailed discussion about the decisions that people made. And so it just felt believable. It just felt like this actually makes sense to me. There were other times when people would try really hard to cover up any sort of weaknesses, or would really move around some sort of well, I really failed here, or this happened during the financial crisis, and so that's why I had to move from here to here, or I started in this field and then I discovered none of it appealed to me, actually, that it was mind-numbing, and so I then moved into a different industry. And being very careful about kind of again articulating the rationale behind each of those decisions is just so critical. And again, I think so many times people just really try hard to appear as though they had it all figured out all along, and that's not usually how it works. And they know that. And even with your goals, if you don't have a very detailed set of ambition, short-term, long-term goals that you're absolutely committed to, it's also okay to state that, to say that this is what I'm envisioning right now, and you need to have some sort of plan. But if there is some ambiguity in terms of, I don't know what I don't know at this stage, and perhaps there's something else out there that's going to be a better fit, it's also okay to leave the door open there too. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, well, so it's fantastic. I think my final question, sort of the legend is that interviewers are trained not to show any sort of facial expression, and applicants are desperately trying to get some sort of sense of how well it may have gone. So is that true? Are you trying to keep stony?
It's interesting. It really depends. It depends on who's interviewing you. But I do know that there were certain individuals who were really nice and very kind, and just seemed like the friendliest people in the world, who would be the most vicious interviewers in terms of their feedback. And then on the flip side, those that seemed really stern and really cold oftentimes were very forgiving. So I don't think that you can actually say that that's how it would play out. So sometimes if you think that like, oh wow, we really hit it off, that means I'm getting in, may not actually be the case. The other really interesting part about this though, and I know that this may not assuage many concerns though, is that you can have an absolutely flawless interview for HBS and not get an offer. And that actually has to do with the fact that depending on the sector that you're coming from, you don't know who you're going to be competing against. But let's just say that there's 10 spaces open in a classroom for consultants, but they ended up having, I don't know, 50 people interview for those consulting positions, and they loved 18 of them, but they have to make a cut somewhere. So sometimes decisions are made on the cutting board, and much later on in the process, where I knew for a fact that the interview with this individual went exceptionally well, but then they ended up not getting an offer. And the first time I went through that, I was very confused. I'm like, how is that possible? How did that happen? This person was outstanding and amazing. I was like, well, maybe they came from a nationality that was overrepresented, or there was something in there that yes, they did nothing wrong. They absolutely aced it and knocked their socks off, and they're still not getting an offer. So again, it doesn't happen very often, but sometimes people think that if they don't get an offer from HBS, that somehow they failed, and that may not actually be the case. So there's a very complex process that goes on, because they want to make sure and balance the classroom so that they have a nice variety of people from many different backgrounds. So certainly consulting and banking, or anyone within the finance sector, is going to be in a very competitive field. So you're always going to be competing against the other people who are also interviewing, who are coming from the same sector.
Right, great. Well, and in one of our other video chats, we talk about that sort of broader picture of finding a place among the 10,000 that are applying to the school. And I would encourage all of the viewers to watch that video. It has the same level of insight and energy that characterizes you, Karla. I can't imagine that you ever kept a stony face through any of your interviewing at HBS. So thank you very much.
No, I one of those, and again, oftentimes I was the silent person in the room, or actually it depended on who I was interviewing with. Sometimes I was allowed to ask sort of clarifying questions. Other times, other interviewers didn't want me to say anything or really react at all. But I'm a people person, so again, that doesn't necessarily give you a lot of information. Again, I don't want to create more anxiety here, but don't think that just because you have sort of a stone-faced person interviewing you that you're not doing well. So try not to panic if at all possible, and pull into the self-confidence that brought you to the footsteps of HBS in terms of thinking that I deserve a spot here. If you've been interviewed, that means that they see the seeds of success in you, and they're hoping that it will work out. So they don't want to bring in anyone that they don't think has a really solid chance of being admitted. So again, if you can really tap into who you are authentically, you're going to do great.
Great. Fantastic advice. Thanks very much, and I encourage all of our viewers to check out the other videos of Karla and our colleagues from Fortuna that come from 14 out of the top schools. Thanks a lot for today's session.
Thank you, Matt. Talk to you soon.